So when I graduated from seminary a long time ago, 36 years ago, but I'm not counting, I remember my first day starting on my call as an associate pastor for a church, and only then realizing something very important. I had spent many years in seminary studying the Bible, reading theology from Barth to Moltmann, learning some of the pastoral skills of being a minister. Yet I realized in the past 4 years, I had not spent much time, you may be surprised by this, exploring the spiritual side of faith. And it hit me that first year that people would be coming to talk to me about their experience of God, and I'd not spent a lot of my own time exploring my own spirituality and contemplative practices that would deepen my experience of God. So I decided I would use my continuing education time, those first years of ministry, to study spiritual practices, how those practices might deepen my sense of God's presence in my life and in the world. And I have to be honest, I was struck, this is back in 1990, by the dearth of resources on Presbyterian spiritual practices. Now, this was understandable on one hand, because we Presbyterians tend to focus on loving God with our minds, favor intellectual approaches to faith. And as a Presbyterian colleague and friend of mine once said, God gave us brains and expects us to use them. And we Presbyterians have a strong emphasis on social justice, a focus on living out the commandment to love our neighbor, especially the neighbor who is vulnerable and in need, the neighbor who is hungry and naked. Emphasis on welcoming the stranger and preaching good news to the poor. That is a focus on our mind and justice, are hallmarks of our tradition. But in some ways, those focuses doesn't lend itself to us to explore our own vital spark at the heart of our faith, the vital experience of God's presence. So those first years of ministry, I read everything I could about spirituality, about spiritual practices, mostly from different traditions. From my Roman Catholic brothers and sisters, I learned about Ignatian spiritual practices, Thomas Keating's centering prayer. I even explored Buddhist practices of meditation, attending a number of silent retreats for 3 days, where we alternated between sitting and walking meditation, supposedly focusing on our breath and body sensations. I spent most of the time meditating on how I could get the heck out of there and get a beer. But I did get a lot from this crash course on spirituality, learning about one might call, I think, a calling for all of us, a calling to a mystic adventure. Because the truth is, all of us are hungry for an experience of God. We all yearn for those mountaintop experiences where maybe we might see more clearly, might love more dearly, where our lives and where the world is transfigured by God's presence. And I've often wondered if Peter and James and John expected to have a mountaintop experience when they went up that mountain with Jesus, or were they surprised by the moment, by the transfiguration of Jesus, by visions of Moses and Elijah, the two pillars of faith representing law and prophets. And one gets a sense in Peter's query of Jesus if they could put up some tents so that they could reside on the mountaintop in that spiritual high forever. Who wouldn't want to be there forever, where everything seems to make sense, everything is united, there is no conflict, only God's presence. And then something odd happens. They hear a voice from a cloud overshadowing them that says, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." Now, truth be told, those words were similar words, almost exact words were used when Jesus was baptized. So there's a connection. It is actually those words that we emphasize when we baptize children among us. It's God's claim. This is my child. This is my beloved with whom I am well pleased. And their response to this mountaintop experience is not a feeling of ecstasy or an experience of nirvana, but something surprising, at least to me, or if you noticed it. What did they do? Remember from the story, what did they do? They fell to the ground, overcome by fear. I guess I don't expect mountaintop experiences to lead to fear or declarations of God's love to result in fear. Now, the Greek word for fear here is unambiguous. In many ways, sometimes the word fear is used to express a sense of awe, particularly in the Hebrew context. But here the Greek word is phobio. It's the very root of our English word phobia, which expresses a sense of alarm and terror so strong one wants to flee. And I find that an odd and strange response from Peter, James, and John to God's voice calling out love for Jesus. Why is this so terrifying? They want to flee the mountain. What is so frightening about God's love? Now, I would posit to you all this morning that in reality, every one of us are afraid of God's love. The radical nature of God's love. That we're all frightened by the grace of God. A gift of God's declaration of being loved. And why would that be? Why are we scared by grace? Why do we resist it so much? Why are we so afraid it's extended to someone else? Especially someone else we don't like. I think some of our resistance to God's grace, our fear of the gift of God's love, is because it names us beloved not because we did the right things, not because we believe the right things. God's grace comes not because we practice the right spiritual practices or that we said the right kinds of prayers. God's grace comes not because we have climbed the mountain ourselves, not because we have achieved mystic level in the game of spirituality, but God's love comes out of the abundance of God's free will to love us all, offering that love to us no matter what. And I'll be honest, that probably scares the heck out of us more than we realize. Why does God's grace frighten us? I think in some ways because we want to feel in control. We want to believe our salvation is dependent on our ability to achieve a mystical experience is rooted in our own actions, on saying the right kind of prayers, on saying the right kind of contemplative practices, on our own ego striving. We'd like to think we are all mystics on the mountaintop. And that if we haven't achieved that yet, then that's because we haven't done the right things. Grace scares us because it shatters our expectations, the boxes we want to put God in. It comes out of nowhere, not in our control. It comes, it breaks us and all our expectations. So what I have come to believe over 30 some odd years of ministry in the church is a realization that we Presbyterians especially understand our spirituality in the sense of that radical gift of grace. And so we are not called to the mountaintop. We're not called to an altar call in which we can hold up ourselves and say we are these great mystics. No, we are called to a life of everyday mysticism that encounters God's grace, not on the mountaintop, but in the mud, in the everyday, ordinary life, and realizing that there are these gifts showered upon us that we don't deserve, that we don't expect, yet somehow comes to us. So I know I've used this before. About once a year I read a sermon by a theologian named Paul Tillich. He was a theologian in the mid-20th century, Union Theological Seminary, and he preached this sermon. I could just read it to you. It's amazing. But the sermon was titled, "You Are Accepted." And he has the best description of our everyday experience of grace. And he writes, "Grace strikes us when we are in great pain and restlessness. And it strikes us when we walk through the dark valley, sometimes of a meaningless and empty life. It strikes us when we feel that our separation from God, from our neighbor, from ourselves is deeper than usual. Maybe because we violated another life, maybe because it's a life we violated of someone we loved, or it might be that we simply are estranged and separated from others. Grace strikes us when our disgust for our own being, our own indifference, our own weakness, our hostility, our lack of direction, our lack of composure, and it becomes intolerable to us. Grace strikes us, he says, when year after year the longed-for perfection of life doesn't happen. Doesn't seem to appear despite all our efforts. When old compulsions and patterns reign within us, as they have for many decades in all our lives. When despair, that's a worry these days, despair destroys all joy and courage. Sometimes, Tillich wrote, at that moment, a wave of light breaks into our darkness, and it is as though a voice out of a cloud were saying to us, "You are accepted. You are accepted." Accepted by that which is greater than you, accepted by that of the name, by something of which you may not know. And don't ask for the name, Paul Tillich says. Perhaps you will figure it out later. But you have this wave of light that says to you, you are beloved and you are accepted. Do not try to do anything with it now. Perhaps later you might use much of it. Do not seek for anything. Do not perform anything. Do not intend anything. Simply accept the fact that you are accepted. And if that happens, we experience grace. And after such an experience of grace, we may not be better than we were before. We may not believe more than we did before, but everything is transfigured. In that moment, grace conquers sin, reconciles bridges of the gulf of estrangement between ourselves and with others, and nothing is demanded of this experience. No religious or moral or intellectual presupposition, nothing but we accept ourselves. We are called in the season of Lent to follow, to honestly examine our hearts and know our brokenness. But doing so knowing that God accepts us, not because we're perfect or because we believe the right things, not because we've achieved certain things. God accepts us simply because God claims us as beloved. And in the season of Lent, you're called to be everyday mystics. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.